For 3 years, waiter James Carter served free coffee to an elderly man who could barely afford to survive. Every morning at 7:15 a.m., the same routine: coffee with cream, 2 sugar cubes, 3 slices of toast. James never charged Robert Williams, the 82-year-old who seemed to have nothing. Then one Tuesday, 4 men in black suits stormed into the Manhattan Cafe with lawyers carrying briefcases. They declared they were there to take the old man home on behalf of the Williams family. Robert, with tired but firm voice, said he no longer had a family. The only person who'd cared for him in 3 years was that waiter. The lawyer turned to James with respect, opened his briefcase, and revealed shocking truth. Robert owned an $8.5 million estate and trust, but lived in a 120 monthly boarding house, surviving on charity coffee. His children, a surgeon and a lawyer who'd searched for him for years, just wanted their father home safely. But Robert refused to return as a defeated old man. He'd only go if James and his 7-year-old daughter came with him. What started as free coffee became an unexpected inheritance, a new family built on kindness, and proof that small gestures can change everything. This is the story of how humanity returned in the most unimaginable way. What city are you watching this video from, and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. The Corner Cafe, Manhattan, 5th Avenue, 7:15 in the morning. James Carter, single waiter with a 7-year-old daughter to support, was preparing the usual coffee for Mr. Robert Williams, an 82-year-old man who had been coming every morning for 3 years. Always the same table by the window. Always the same order: coffee with cream, 2 sugar cubes, 3 slices of toast with butter and jam. James didn't charge the old man anything, who seemed to have barely enough to survive. That Tuesday morning, however, the cafe door opened violently. 4 men in black suits entered like a dark wave. Behind them, 2 lawyers with leather briefcases. They stopped in front of the old man's table. The head of the security team declared they were there on behalf of the Williams family to take the old man back home. Robert, with a tired but firm voice, responded that he no longer had a family, that the only person who had taken care of him in 3 years was that waiter. The lawyer turned toward James with an expression that mixed surprise and respect. Then he opened the briefcase and took out a document. James didn't know yet that what was about to happen would change his life and his daughter's forever. James Carter was 35 years old and carried on his shoulders the weight of 2 lives, his and his daughter Emily's. 3 years ago, his wife Sarah had died of breast cancer. 29 years old, too young, too fast. Emily was 4 years old when she lost her mother. Now James worked as a waiter at the Corner Cafe on 5th Avenue. It wasn't the job he had dreamed of, but it paid the rent for his small 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn and allowed Emily to go to school with dignity. Mr. Robert Williams had appeared 3 years ago, on a Monday morning in November. A thin old man with a coat too big, trembling hands while counting coins for a coffee. He always sat at the table by the window, the least visible, and made the coffee last an hour with small sips. After a week, James had started bringing him a free donut, saying it had been left over. The old man had understood the kind lie, but had accepted it with gratitude. After a month, toast also arrived. After 2 months, James no longer charged him even for the coffee. Little by little, they had started to talk. Small conversations about the weather, the city, then fragments of life. Robert had been an architect. He had worked on important projects in New York in the 60s. He had had a wife, dead 15 years ago. He had 2 children, but he no longer saw them. He didn't explain why, and James didn't ask. Robert lived in a boarding house near Penn Station, a room with a bed and a window facing an interior courtyard. His pension barely covered rent and some cheap food. James understood that loneliness. After Sarah's death, he had felt the same emptiness. The difference was that he had Emily. Robert had no one, and perhaps that's why James took care of him. Because he understood that sometimes the kindness of a stranger is the only thing that keeps you tied to the world. That Tuesday morning, James had prepared the usual coffee. 3 years, 119 days, 119 coffees, 119 small moments of shared humanity. He brought the tray to the table where Robert was already seated. The old man raised his gaze with that small smile and thanked him, calling him son. James responded as always that it was no trouble, that his company was valuable. Then the door opened violently. 4 men in black suits entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, earpieces in their ears, the air of those accustomed to being obeyed. Bodyguards. Behind them, 2 older men in gray suits. Leather briefcases. Expensive lawyers. The cafe fell silent. The group stopped in front of Robert's table. The tallest declared they were there on behalf of the Williams family. That it was time to return home. That his children were waiting for him. James stood paralyzed with the empty tray in hand. Robert didn't move. He kept looking at his coffee as if those men didn't exist. The silence became heavy. The older lawyer took out a document explaining they had a court order, that the children had requested custody for health reasons. Robert finally raised his gaze. His tired eyes filled with ancient pain. He declared in a small but firm voice that he no longer had a family. That the only person who had taken care of him in 3 years was that waiter. He pointed at James. Everyone turned. The lawyer studied James for a long moment. Then something in his gaze changed. Respect, perhaps. He turned toward Robert, explaining that his children wanted him to return to the family estate, to be cared for as he should be. An 82-year-old man shouldn't be living in a miserable boarding house eating in cheap cafes. Robert laughed bitterly. He asked where those concerned children were when his wife died and he sank into depression. Where were they when he lost everything in the collapse of his company? Where were they in these 3 years when he came here every morning? Because that waiter was the only person who treated him with dignity. Then, with a cutting voice, he suggested that perhaps they had remembered him now, because they had remembered what he owned. The lawyer closed the briefcase slowly and asked to speak in private. Robert shook his head, declaring that everything could be said there in front of James, the only person he trusted. The lawyer hesitated, then nodded and sat at the table. The guards remained standing like statues. The other lawyer stayed behind his colleague. The lawyer began to recount. 15 years ago, after his wife's death, Robert had gone through a difficult period. He had started making risky decisions with his architecture firm. Projects too ambitious, dangerous investments. In 2012, the company went bankrupt. He lost everything. Estate, savings, reputation. His children, Alexander and Barbara, had tried to help him. They had offered him money, a room in their homes. But Robert had rejected everything, accusing them of wanting to control his life, of treating him like an incapable old man. Then he disappeared. For 3 years, they didn't know if he was alive or dead. When they finally found him in the miserable boarding house, he had thrown Barbara out. He had said he didn't want their pity. They, after years of rejected attempts, had given up. James listened in silence, feeling how the pieces of a painful story fit together. Robert didn't raise his gaze. He kept looking at the already cold coffee. The lawyer continued, explaining that 2 weeks ago Alexander had received a call from the hospital. Robert had fainted in the street. Dehydration, malnutrition. When they discharged him, Alexander decided that it was enough, that he couldn't keep letting him die slowly. James felt something tighten in his chest. Robert had been hospitalized and he didn't know. He had thought it was just the flu. The lawyer added there was something more. Robert's wife, Rose, before dying, had left a will. She had left Robert the complete property of the family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, plus a significant financial trust. The children hadn't inherited anything directly. Rose wanted Robert to be financially protected. The lawyer opened the briefcase again and took out documents. The trust was worth $5 million. The estate another $3.5 million. Robert Williams owned $8.5 million and was living in a $120 a month boarding house, eating bread and coffee offered by charity. The silence in the cafe became absolute. James felt his legs give way. He leaned on the table. The lawyer explained that the children didn't want the money. Both had successful careers. Alexander was a surgeon, Barbara a lawyer. They only wanted their father to come home, to be cared for, not to die alone in a freezing room. Robert shook his head. In a whispered voice, he explained it wasn't about money or houses. It was about dignity. When Rose died, he lost himself. When the children tried to help him, he rejected them because he couldn't bear them seeing him so weak. It was better to disappear, to become nobody. He turned toward James and for the first time in 3 years showed tears in his eyes. He explained that in that cafe, with that young man who brought him coffee without asking for anything, he had found a piece of dignity. There he was, just Robert. Not the failure, not the pathetic widower. James felt his throat tighten. He put a hand on the old man's shoulder. The lawyer looked at James with attention and revealed he had investigated him. He knew he was a waiter for 3 years, that before he was a graphic designer, that he had a 7-year-old daughter, that his wife had died of cancer. He knew that James had been offering coffee to a stranger for 3 years out of pure kindness. Robert had spoken of him as a son. The old man put his trembling hand over James's, confirming that in those 3 years, James had been more of a son than his real children ever were. The lawyer took out another document and placed it on the table. He explained that Robert had the right to decide where to live and with whom. The court order was a bluff. The children had no legal power to force him, but they were desperate. Barbara cried on the phone. Alexander didn't sleep. They only wanted their father to be safe. But Robert was right about one thing. He couldn't return as the old man to be tolerated. He had to return with dignity, on his own terms. And here James came in. The lawyer proposed something incredible. James should go live at the Greenwich estate with Robert. As a personal assistant, or simply as a friend, he would be paid generously. James blinked, trying to process. The lawyer specified that Emily would also come. The estate had 12 rooms, enough space for everyone. Emily would have her own room, a garden. James would no longer have to work at the cafe, and Robert would return home not as a defeated old man, but as a man who had found a new family built on kindness. Robert looked at James with eyes full of fragile hope. He said he knew it was absurd, that he couldn't ask someone to leave everything, but those 3 years had given him a reason to live. And if there was even the smallest possibility that James and Emily would become part of his life permanently, he would be the happiest man in the world. James felt the crushing weight of that request. It was madness, completely absurd. But then he thought about Emily, about their small Brooklyn apartment, about secondhand clothes, about the impossible choices between bills and school books. He thought about how tired he was, and he thought about Robert, about 3 years of coffees, 3 years of shared solitude. He wasn't a stranger. He had become part of his life. He asked to be able to think about it. The lawyer agreed, explaining that the children were outside in the car and wanted to talk to their father. Robert stiffened, declaring he didn't want to see them. The lawyer said gently that perhaps it was time to start, that Barbara had brought old photos and Alexander a letter. 12 years was too long for pride. The old man closed his eyes. Tears finally fell. James squeezed his hand and told him softly that if he wanted to see his children, he would be there. He didn't have to do it alone. Robert opened his eyes with infinite gratitude and nodded. The lawyer made a sign and a guard went out. A few minutes later, 2 people entered. A woman about 50, elegant, eyes red from crying. A man slightly older, tall, with the same nose as Robert. When they saw their father, they stopped. Barbara brought a hand to her mouth. Alexander clenched his jaw. Barbara whispered, "Dad." Robert didn't respond immediately. He looked at them, seeing not the adults they were, but the children they had been, his little girl running in the garden, his son playing football. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. Everything he had lost through pride and pain. He finally responded in a broken voice, greeting them, and in that small cafe on 5th Avenue, 12 years of silence began to crumble. That afternoon, James returned to his apartment with his head spinning. He sat on the worn sofa looking at the peeling walls. The small table where Emily did her homework. He thought about the proposal. An estate in Greenwich, 12 rooms, a garden, a salary that solved all problems, and all he had to do was be near an old man he already considered a friend. It seemed too good to be true. During the conversation in the cafe, he had seen Robert's children. Their genuine pain. They didn't seem like people plotting something. He had also seen Robert hug Barbara after she ran across the cafe and threw herself into her father's arms, sobbing apologies. And Robert crying, saying it was he who had been wrong. Alexander, who had approached more rigidly, but with silent tears, asking his father to come home. And Robert, who had looked at James seeking strength. And James, who had nodded, saying to go, to reunite with his family, but that he would be there if he wanted. Now James looked at the phone. The lawyer had given him a number, and 2 days to decide. He had also given him the estate's address, saying he could visit it. He went to pick up Emily from school. The girl ran toward him with her always luminous smile and a drawing. 2 figures holding hands, a third above in the clouds. Emily called her mother, Grandma in Heaven. James hugged her, saying the drawing was beautiful. That night, after putting Emily to bed, he called the lawyer. He wanted to see the estate before deciding. The next day would work. The next day, James took the train to Greenwich with Emily. The girl was excited, asking infinite questions. James had only told her they were visiting a friend's house. When they arrived at the address, James thought there was a mistake, a wrought iron gate. A gravel path, a 19th century estate with 3 floors, cream-colored tall windows, wrought iron balconies, an enormous garden with century-old trees, rose bushes, a fountain with marble statues. Emily pulled on James's hand with wide eyes, asking who lived there. A prince, the gate opened. A housekeeper received them, saying Robert was waiting for them. They crossed the garden in a state of amazement. Emily turned her head in all directions. They entered. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, carved wooden stairs, valuable paintings. James felt completely out of place. Robert was waiting for them in the living room. When he saw them, he stood up with difficulty and his face lit up. Emily hid behind her father's legs. Robert approached, knelt with difficulty at the girl's height. He introduced himself, explaining he was her father's friend. He asked if she liked the house, then said it was too big for an old man alone. But if she and her father came to live there, perhaps it wouldn't be so empty anymore. Emily looked at her father with questioning eyes. James also knelt, taking his daughter's hand. He explained that Robert had offered him a job, to take care of him, to keep him company, and if he accepted, they would live there. She would have a room as big as their entire apartment, a garden to play in. Emily looked at the house, then at Robert, then at her father. With the simple wisdom of children, she asked the only question that mattered. If Mr. Robert was good. James smiled with eyes filling with tears, saying he was the kindest person he knew. Emily nodded decidedly. Then it was okay. They could live there. And so, with the simplicity of a 7-year-old girl, the decision was made. The move happened a week later. James and Emily didn't have much. 2 suitcases of clothes, boxes of books and toys, photos of Sarah that James always carried with him. Joe at the cafe had cried, saying James was the best waiter he'd had, but also that he was happy for him, that he deserved it. At the Greenwich estate, Robert had prepared 2 rooms. For Emily, a princess room with pink walls, a canopy bed, shelves full of new toys bought by Robert and Barbara. Emily burst into tears of joy. She hugged Robert, calling him Grandpa Robert. The old man was moved. Grandpa. Nobody had called him that in years. For James, a suite on the 2nd floor with bedroom, private bathroom, and a study. Robert had told him he didn't have to do anything in particular. Just be there. Be present. The salary was embarrassingly generous. $6,000 a month. The first days were strange. James felt like a guest in a luxury hotel. But Robert had a gentle way of making him feel comfortable, showing that he wasn't an employee, but a friend. They continued the morning routine. Breakfast together. Coffee with toast. Quiet conversations while Emily played in the garden. The difference was that now Robert was no longer alone. He didn't have to count coins. He didn't have to fear being a burden. Barbara and Alexander came regularly. At first the visits were tense, full of uncomfortable silences. But little by little, with James often present as a silent mediator, they started to really talk, to apologize, to explain, to forgive. One night, 2 months later, Robert called James to his study, a room full of books and old architectural projects. He had a wooden box open on the desk with legal documents. He explained it was his will. Modified the week before, he had divided the assets equitably. 1/3 for Alexander, 1/3 for Barbara, 1/3 for James and Emily. James stood up abruptly, protesting he couldn't accept. Robert raised a hand, stopping him. He explained that these last months had been the happiest since Rose died. Not because of the money or the house, but because of James and Emily. Because every morning he woke up knowing he wasn't alone. That there was a girl who called him Grandpa and a man who treated him like a father. James objected, mentioning the children. Robert responded they agreed. Alexander had said it was fair. Barbara had cried, hugging him, saying he had always been too proud to accept help. But now, finally, he was letting someone help him. They wanted James to be part of the family, officially, legally. James sat back down, overwhelmed, not knowing what to say. Robert smiled, saying not to say anything. Just accept. Let an old man give what he had never been able to give his real children when they needed it. Security and love without conditions. 3 years later, on a November morning similar to the one when it all began, James woke up in his room. He looked toward the garden where leaves fell in a golden dance. Emily, now 10 years old, was playing with Alexander's grandchildren. Children who called her cousin, although blood didn't unite them. Robert was 85 years old. He was more fragile, slower, but his eyes were alive in a new way. He had returned to drawing architectural projects as a hobby. The fact that he did it showed how much he had truly returned to living. That morning, like every morning, James prepared the coffee and brought it to Robert on the terrace where he liked to sit. Coffee with cream, 2 sugar cubes, 3 slices of toast with jam. Some rituals were too beautiful to change. They sat drinking in comfortable silence, watching Emily play. Robert said he had thought a lot about how they had met. A waiter offering coffee to an old man in a cafe. Who would have thought it would end like this? James smiled, saying life was strange, that sometimes kindness returned in unimaginable ways. Robert shook his head, correcting him. It hadn't been kindness. It had been humanity. James had seen him. He hadn't seen a pathetic old man to help out of pity. He had seen him as a person, and that was the most precious thing you could give someone. After a silence, Robert added he had talked to the doctor. His heart was weak. Maybe a year, maybe 2. James felt his chest tighten, protesting. Robert said calmly they had to talk about it, that he had to thank him for those years. For Emily. For giving him a family when he thought he didn't deserve one. He would die happy. Not many could say that. James felt tears burn. He took the old man's fragile hand, saying Robert had also saved him. After Sarah, he felt like he was drowning. Emily was the only thing keeping him afloat. But meeting Robert, taking care of him, had given him a purpose. Had made him remember that life continues, that you can build new families, new meanings. Robert smiled with shining eyes, saying then they were even. Emily ran toward them with red cheeks and a luminous smile. Calling Dad! And Grandpa, to show them the treehouse built with the cousins. James and Robert looked at each other, laughed, stood up and followed Emily to the garden, a girl running, a man and an old man walking side by side, 3 pieces of an improbable family that destiny had brought together in a small cafe. As they walked under golden leaves falling softly, James thought about how life was full of surprises, how a simple act of kindness could transform into something so big and beautiful. How sometimes families aren't those you're born into, but those you build with choices, care, love given freely. Robert Williams died 2 years later. Serene in his bed, surrounded by Alexander, Barbara, James, Emily, and all the grandchildren. His last words were for James, thanking him, calling him his son. At the funeral, James read a speech that talked about how 3 years ago he had met an old man in a cafe, thinking to help him with a coffee. not knowing that coffee would change his life. That old man would teach him that family isn't just blood, but choice. That love can be born in the most improbable places. The Greenwich estate, according to the will, was divided among Alexander, Barbara, and James. The three decided not to sell it. To keep it as a family home where everyone could gather, Emily grew up there with 2 uncles who adored her and cousins who were siblings in everything except blood, and every morning James prepared coffee in the large kitchen and drank it looking at the garden, remembering the old man who had welcomed him like a son. Coffee with cream. 2 sugar cubes. Some rituals are too precious to forget. Give it a like if you believe kindness is the world's most valuable currency. Comment if you also believe true families are built with love, not just blood. Share this story to remember that a small gesture can change everything. Subscribe for more stories that prove humanity still exists, even in the most difficult times. James had only offered a coffee. He wasn't looking for rewards. Didn't expect miracles. He just wanted a lonely old man to know that someone saw him, appreciated him, cared for him, and in return, he received a family, a home, and the certainty that in life, what you give always returns. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in the way you expect, but it always returns, because the universe has a way of balancing things, of rewarding those who choose kindness when it would be easier to look away. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's the true meaning of everything, being human.